What is up, everyone? Welcome back to Disclosure Team. I'm your host, Vinny Adams. Following is a panel discussion between Nick Gold, Lester Nare, and Ronak Patel. In this video, we cover all aspects of the really government-focused side of the UAP subject, focusing on the UAP Disclosure Act 2.0 for this year's upcoming NDAA. That'll be for the fiscal year 2025. But we also look back at what happened last year as well when it comes to the UAPDA, the gutting of it, and so much more. I found this to be a very, very informative conversation, and I really hope people take the time to listen, because these guys certainly know their stuff. If you enjoy these videos, please take a second to hit that subscribe button, hit the like button, comment down below, and share it with your friends. I really appreciate all of the support. I hope you enjoy this conversation with Lester Nare, Ronak Patel, and Nick Gold. All right, gentlemen, thank you so much for joining me today. How is everyone?
Doing good.
Great. Good, man. Well, listen, the great thing is that as of the recording of this conversation, it is the 1-year anniversary of the congressional hearing with David Grush, Ryan Graves, and David Fravor. 1 year since that amazing event. I just wondered if anyone has any thoughts now, 1 year on any aspect of that day.
I can't believe it was a year ago. I was really tired then because I woke up super early to go down to DC, and here we are a year later. And I'll just say I think a lot's happened since then. I think that hearing brought a lot of attention to the issue. I've noticed a lot of people who hadn't been following it particularly closely. That was very kind of entrancing to see those guys go up there in that kind of a setting and say what they said. And I think this came up on a little X conversation yesterday. We have to really pay attention to the wins that have been had since that day, which that day helped precipitate in a significant way. We'll be talking today about what's coming legislatively this year and what's in the coming down the pike. But we have to remember the FY24 NDAA was signed into law by President Biden, and it requires every federal agency, civilian, military, and intelligence, to hand every UAP record, unclassified and classified, over to the National Archives and Records Administration. There's things that would be nice to have in addition to what was passed, the review board, other aspects of UAPDA, which we'll discuss. But we should really pay attention to that win, because it really now allows the public to place pressure on a variety of government officials, agencies, points of contact, our own elected officials, to say, that law was passed. We expect to see it happen. It was with the presumption of declassification for the majority of records, especially those 25 years and older. And we hold you to it, to do what was passed in the law. So that is a huge win. And we have that hearing, and those guys, obviously Graves, Fravor, and Grush, as a huge point of focus to thank for allowing us to kind of create the impetus for that to happen. It's a huge win.
I couldn't agree more. And, it is crazy to think that it was a year ago. And, I think you're absolutely right, Nick, that we need to count our wins, and every little incremental piece of progress is meaningful. You can just even see in the number and scale and type of people and conversations and initiatives that now exist a year later that did not exist when that hearing happened. And that hearing is one of the big reasons why all of that now infrastructure exists in the space. Again, subject matter experts, study programs, new tools, new services that are legitimizing this issue in a space that it hasn't been legitimized before. That's not to say that his history is not legitimate. It is just to say we're now in forums that allow us to adjudicate what the actual sort of issue is in a formalized context that has teeth. And I do think you bringing up the point, Nick, that last year's NDAA for FY 2024 had teeth in it to some extent. It wasn't just a complete dud, and we are going to be able to build off of that going into this cycle. I think it's, again, the progress is continuing apace, despite the lack of media following that said progress in any kind of robust manner.
I would have to agree with both of you guys there. It's again, I can't believe it's been a year as well, and a lot has happened since. And I will say that the public interest and curiosity has increased since that hearing, especially having personal conversations with a variety of folks, from family members to sort of coworkers and colleagues. And it's just great to see. And a lot of work still needs to be done since that hearing, but we definitely need to count our wins, like you guys said.
Yeah, I agree with you all. I think what I found more recently when I look back to that day 1 year ago is that it would be very easy for people to say, well, in a year's time, imagine we should have all of these whistleblowers and all of this information come out. And I think that's probably a little naive, but I think what we realize is that it opened so much up behind the scenes for new organizations, new groups, new conversations, to kind of really start working the gears behind the scenes to kind of keep the subject moving forward in this current climate, which we all know is very difficult at the moment with the amount of things that are happening in the US, but also globally, especially now we're into this election year with things that have happened in the news recently have been absolutely crazy. So for me personally, I'm really happy with the way things have gone. And I think it's a testament to a lot of the hard work that people have been putting in.
I think it's important for people to remember that when we don't operate in isolation. I say this all the time. There are plenty of mainstream political or policy issues that matter to hundreds of millions of people that are loud and active much more in a much more prominent way than we are as a community in the political space, that aren't able to get the things they care about passed and adjudicated. So the fact that we have the level of attention from members of Congress and willingness to take action despite having competing issues that have more public outcry to deal with is a really, really big deal. So I think we shouldn't lose sight of the fact that, again, we're not working in isolation. We're competing with every other subject matter that, at least as it pertains to the government disclosure, advocacy, public transparency conversation. And I think it's fantastic because we're now in what fourth or fifth year of consecutive legislation around this subject that is building on what's come before. There's not many other subjects that you can say have had that level of success so quickly early on in its political relevancy.
Yep, I totally agree, Lester. And the other thing to remember is this is despite the lack of media attention on the issue. I was talking to some folks just the other day, telling them the government has been regulating UAP. They've acknowledged that they're real, including some that are highly anomalous and apparently technological. These things have been validated, and they were like, "What are you talking about? Why haven't I seen this anywhere in the news?" And it's like, yeah, they haven't really been doing their job as it relates to this issue, the fourth estate, especially in larger mainstream media. But this is the thing. Let's thank those in independent media. Let's thank folks like yourself, Vinny, obviously, and other podcasters, other researchers, people who bring focus to this issue. Thank you, Lester and Ronak, obviously, for the work that you've done to rally the community. We drove a pretty significant call campaign last year, our two organizations, UAPcaucus.com and, of course, declassifyuap.org. And, that cycle is going to be picking up soon for UAPDA 2.0, as people are kind of shorthanding it. But we're getting that real work done, as Lester said. We're doing it in a pretty compressed period of time. We have significant legislative allies, like the leader of the Senate. I mean, that is no small feat, amongst a cadre of other well-respected senators, and it's bipartisan of all issues, of course. We talk about this. Funny that this is the thing that seems to bring the parties together, but we'll obviously all take it. And that helps keep the motivation and momentum going as well. So we got to keep building on that. The incrementalism is completely fine when it's incremental to this degree year after year. The trend line looks fantastic. Personally, maybe I'm being a little too hopeful here, but you might as well be, and cross your fingers. I think we're going to see significant additional wins in the next maybe 1 to 2 year period, as far as what's actually relayed to the public, not just the passage of laws, but some of the kind of consequences that boil up because of the laws that have already been passed. There seems to be some motivation from inside of government to change the story of how this topic has been communicated to the public. I'm getting whiffs of that from a variety of quarters. And I think just continues to bode really well for what July 26, 2025 is going to look like.
Yeah, exactly. You mentioned UAPDA 2.0 there, and let's look back at the UAP Disclosure Act of last year. You know, it was a build up through the sort of towards the end of the year with a lot of excitement because of the amount of language that was written and being put forward, only to be kind of gutted right almost at the finish line, as it were, which obviously disappointed a lot of people, and it felt like the UAP subject took a bit of a knock there, and we've learned some things about that since, about why. Let's get into that and what's sort of come out recently, especially with an interview that our colleague Marek van Rennenkamp did with Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. So who wants to kind of bring that out into this conversation about what we've learned?
I think there's been a lot of back and forth in the postmortem around the UAPDA getting gutted last year to try to understand what was the cause. And people have different sources. And I think it's important to recognize that like multiple things can be true here around the source of what caused the issues last year. So, I know we've seen the likes of Chris Sharp over at Liberation Times put out several pieces around targeting the Intelligence and Armed Services House Committee Chairman as the source for the mics, as alongside the Speaker of the House as the source for the gutting of the UAPDA when it went to conference committee last year. The other major kind of player, speaking to a potential explanation has been Douglas Dean Johnson, who has made the other suggestion that this was really just pushback from the Pentagon and people on the inside, not contractors specifically, but just the government folks. And then Merrick has now added fuel to that fire as kind of getting Kirkpatrick on the record, stating something that, again, if you are engaged in the political conversation in the US around policy regularly, it would not be a surprise for you to hear the statement that the NDAA, when there's amendments in it, any of the relevant agencies that those amendments are going to sort of impact or affect, have an open dialogue conversation back and forth to provide feedback to those who've created the legislation to, again, do things that are very normal. Is this feasible? Like, is this going to run into issues around implementation for things that we can't see in Congress, but you can see from within the executive branch? And that conversation happened from AARO in terms of giving direct feedback around what should be or not be included in the UAPDA. We did not necessarily know that explicitly on the record, although that's a part of the process, until Merrick's interview with Kirkpatrick, where he confirmed that. And then Douglas Dean Johnson has put out a follow-up article with the actual rewrite that AARO put out with line item crossouts of what they wanted removed. And it's so interesting, and we could spend a long time talking about the things that they chose to remove or include. They chose to remove legacy program, but keep the definition of non-human intelligence. So there's some interesting things. Ultimately, the rewrite from AARO still had more in it than what was ultimately passed in the FY 2024 version, which is, again, also interesting. But I think ultimately here, the point being, there can be multiple things that are true. There have been pushback from the mics as well as the feedback from AARO that ultimately ended up in the ultra gutted version of last year. And I think it's very valuable to be able to see what was crossed out in the rewrites to understand what is the surface area of the legislation that they believe to be problematic, or basically sort of elucidates this idea that they were trying to basically insert AARO as a sort of like this honey trap, where instead of the director and the review board, AARO basically would catch everything and in theory be able to put it back in the box, right? So I thought it was extremely fascinating to see not only the long-term search for the answers here, but the more recent news, both with the interview and the rewrite around this.
And it gives us some more information in that, AARO has been kind of making this claim, telling the story that, the review board is duplicative of what their own, capabilities are and what they were charged with. And well, I mean, there is a read to the original legislation that established AARO that might be indicative of that. AARO was supposed to be a vehicle towards sharing with both of the Congress and the public more information about the UAP topic and what's going on with this. But it's kind of a silver lining, I think. We also have the actions and the reports that AARO have actually put out. We have a history report that was universally panned by people who know the topic, and I think was probably not terribly well received by the legislators who mandated the creation of that history report. As I've joked, I did better college reports, 6 hours before they were due in college. It was really quite laughable. There were some very public takedowns. And again, I think that helped educate the actual legislators who mandated AARO's creation to understand it's not really doing that set of tasks, and maybe even ourselves as legislators aren't getting the full story. We've all seen not only the history report, but the fact that the vast majority of the work AARO has done to clarify the UAP topic to Congress and the public is showing us, possible airplane videos and telling us, oh, look, it wasn't a UAP. And it's like, well, those aren't the ones we care about, guys. We care about the ones that look like UAP, that do UAP things, that are clearly captured. And like you acknowledge, for something like 3 to 5% of your caseload, which is dozens of cases, really is doing something quite extraordinary that is not explainable trivially, which they've gone on the record and said is a thing. It's just not what they're showing anyone. And we don't obviously have access to what's being shown to some legislators behind closed doors. But, we know that revealing UAP information is not really what AARO has been doing. And so I think their argument that this more independent review board that really is truly charged with declassifying the information around the topic, which goes beyond what AARO's mandate was, is really quite required at this point, because if AARO is going to put most of its focus in public communications around things that don't actually end up resolving as UAP, what are they doing? We obviously need some more independent actors to kind of dig in there and make sure that the public and even Congress's interest in learning about the real UAP, that smaller percentage of cases that do phenomenal things, it really just needs to be doubled down and focused on by someone who cares to explore those things, whereas AARO does not seem to want to draw attention to that.
Yeah, anything to add on to that, Ronak, at all?
Quite a bit, but I'll just try to keep it short. Nick, you made a good point in that AARO is, they're not really trying to get down into the weeds on the truly anomalous cases that they have in their holdings. For example, in Merrick's recent interview with the former director of AARO, Sean Kirkpatrick, Merrick tried asking him, like, what about those 2 to 4% of cases that you guys have that are more anomalous? And, Dr. Kirkpatrick wasn't really getting into the weeds of that. And he was even asked, like, what's the most significant case where you left and thought, oh, wow, that was probably, highly anomalous. And he got into a case that ended up being solved and still didn't really get into there. And ultimately said, I haven't seen anything that was anomalous to the point that I would think that it was extraterrestrial or highly advanced in its origin, which is really contradictory as to what we've seen publicly. And for example, I'll reference the DOD Inspector General's evaluation report that came out earlier this year. So in that report, it states that the DOD has not used a coordinated approach to detect, report, collect, analyze, and identify UAP. They have largely excluded geographic combatant commands. And ultimately, this is affecting our national security and our military forces. So clearly something is going on. And when we think about all the pilots that are reporting these UAP, civilian, military, something strange is going on. And we need to get to the bottom of it. And that's something that the UAPDA, is trying to do. And I know there's nuances with the eminent domain and a little bit of controversy there. But I think there needs to be the space for people to have a healthy discussion on this legislation, both from the public and the legislators, and a bridge in between. And I feel like that's how Declassify UAP and UAP Caucus sort of serve as that bridge to try to include the public in these conversations, because there is a lot of nuances and we want to bring in everybody under the tent to have a healthy discussion on how to try to do this effectively.
And I just want to say one point, Ronak, you mentioned the DOD IG report that came out about UAP. Just again, going back to July 26th, a year ago today, what we've learned, and I think that came out in January, the declassified version of the report that was generated by the DOD IG, partially in response to Grush's DOD IG complaints and having worked with them. And what we learned is that I think it was August of 2023, this DOD IG report hit, or in that time frame. So it was post-hearing, but in the immediate aftermath, again, more ripples that came out from a series of events, but certainly including the public hearing.
And just to clarify for the viewers, that report in August was the classified version of the evaluation report.
Yes. So we learned, half a year later, essentially, what had already occurred in the immediate aftermath. And it was that not only did the DOD IG levy this UAP report that said this is a cluster, more or less. I mean, that's what it said. The commands, the combatant commands, across DOD, really from top to bottom, left to right, are not handling UAP in a reasonable and cohesive manner. And this presents a real risk to national security. It was said, quite clearly. And what that led to was the Joint Chiefs of Staff issuing across all commands new guidance on how, let's just say it, UFOs need to be handled by all of these combatant commands across the DoD, and that coming as a command from the very top of DoD on down and across the command. So, I mean, that was major, again, kind of fallout from these events. We learn about it in this sort of staggered way, but that clearly acknowledges that this is not just a case of like, oh yeah, sometimes we don't immediately make out that it's an airplane. The Joint Chiefs of Staff would not be issuing those kinds of commands if this was a matter of, sometimes we're misidentifying airplanes or whatever. It's not what we're talking about. And, I think people have very valid concerns and criticisms of Kirkpatrick now that we kind of have saw his whole tenure. I think a lot of us gave him a lot of opportunity. I think even myself, I really agreed with some of his earlier statements about what the scientific process needed to be. I'm an SCU member. I worked with the Galileo Project at one point. I believe in the scientific approach. We didn't see any science out of AARO. We saw trust me, bro. And we saw qualifiers left and right, like what is verified extraterrestrial evidence versus just other extraterrestrial evidence, or why is most incidents explainable, but let's talk about that smaller percentage that aren't. So I think we can see that Kirkpatrick was not necessarily operating in good faith, or was just so inherently biased, was not a person who was capable of investigating the issue with true open-mindedness. Yet clearly not everyone, even much more high on the pay scale at DoD, appears to agree with him or his work. And I think that causes real concerns, and it's more reasons why things like the actual review board, which might again become part of the UAPDA because of its sort of reintroduction at this point, at least tentative reintroduction as an amendment by now Rounds and Schumer. They're letting the Republican lead it. But again, it's just more argument for why a truly independent body is necessary. And going to the trust me, bro guys is probably not going to change things up at this point.
I think it's important to point out that the UAPDA, the actual bill legislative text, begins with findings that define the reason for the existence of the legislation and why it's as robust as it is. And it effectively is accusing the same people who control AARO of hiding the information, not only from the American people, but also from the legislative branch. So it's literally defined in the legislation that AARO can't be an honest broker because their controlling authority has been the one hiding the information to begin with. So on its face, it can't be duplicative because the accusation is that you're not doing your job.
Yeah, and we've recently seen AARO's second birthday. They've been going for 2 years now, and the optics, looking from especially the UFO community, a lot of distrust, a lot of negativity, and we even witnessed a lot of frustration coming from Sean Kirkpatrick while he was in the job, and definitely since. And one thing that really struck me in that interview with Marek was that I think there was numerous occasions where Kirkpatrick always fell back on that, well, I had access to everything point. He really, really focused on that a lot, as if to say, look, if there was something here, I would have definitely seen it. And because of the negative optics, I didn't believe that for a second. What are your thoughts on that and what he may had or had not had access to?
I think there's a little bit of an interesting thing generally going on around science communication generally, where there is a level of condescension that happens, and we've seen this in the Terrence Howard, Eric Weinstein, Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of battle, where you see two approaches of science communication. One, which is I'm in my ivory tower and I tell you what it is, and that's what it is, which is sort of the Neil deGrasse Tyson version of this, where versus the Eric Weinstein version, which is let me work with you down where you are and help lift you up to an understanding of why I believe what I believe. And I think I'm just of the view that you have to be top down, not bottom up, not top down, as it relates to this issue. Because if you just tell people I know because I know, again, you're arguing about having a scientific process, but then saying I know everything, so you just have to believe that, are fundamentally contradictory statements and views. So I think it's just I think Kirkpatrick didn't want to be there. I think he didn't want that job. If you look at his work history, he's always been the guy who helps stand up these new cross-functional offices, but that are always internal, right? And public relations and public affairs, a lot of people like to sort of poo-poo it as not a real job or like not something that requires a lot of skill set. But he clearly has none of the skills required to be a public-facing leader in this context. He might be great internally and understands the machinations of bureaucracy and that kind of stuff. But this is a fundamentally different role. And I think this is a struggle that most of these DOD types, whether they are pro or anti transparency around this issue, I think they all struggle with this, which is how do you actually engage in the public discourse, which is not authentic to their life experience working in the black world. So I think he just was not built for the job. And that was then expressed by his poor execution in public communication, which was a core mandate for what AARO was supposed to accomplish.
And I have just one other thing that I've been trying to get consistently asked. Would love to see people kind of put this to, if not now Kirkpatrick, because he's, I don't think the best representative of AARO and DOD at this point, but for anyone who is kind of speaking on their behalf, well, the question simply becomes, well, if UAP are a nothing burger, if UAP have revealed themselves to be a nothing burger over, now 8-ish decades, if it all comes down to misidentified, seagulls and balloons, as we joke, why don't you declassify even a single intelligence assessment on what we think UAP might be? What are the half a dozen bullet points on the one PowerPoint slide that the president gets? That led Obama to say, because apparently he has access to that kind of at least high-level summary that says there are indeed things flying around that we don't understand. That's what Obama said based on what he had access to. We have the current director of national intelligence, the highest ranking individual in the intelligence community, who all IC agencies report up to, who not only has gone on the record again and again saying overclassification is presenting real risks to democracy in America, but who herself said at a public event at the National Cathedral, when asked about like what these UAP might be, acknowledged, haltingly in her recollection of it, she said, we are trying to figure out, we presumably being the intelligence community, if some of the UAP in the other category per the schema that AARO developed, where there's kind of these 5 main UAP categories, one being other, which is where those outlier UAP seem to be kind of buried. She goes, we are trying to figure out if some of the UAP in the other category might be extraterrestrial, she said. We have the former director of the CIA, John Brennan, who in a podcast conversation said they might represent another form of life. And he was like, Brennan is a pretty, usually right in front of the camera kind of guy. Rah, rah, rah. And he was like squirming as he was saying it. And it was clearly like racking his brain as he was finding the words and kind of hunting for the language to express that. We have the guy who ran the February 23 UAP shootdown operations, who runs NORAD today, General Van Herk, who, when asked by the New York Times, what are you shooting at? Everyone's wondering if they're extraterrestrials. He goes, I can't take it off the table until we recover them. Head of NORAD saying that. I mean, we have so many examples of these kinds of things. Why are those officials, again, generally much higher on the pay scale than Sean Kirkpatrick, saying those kind of things based on what they've been made privy to? Yet Sean, who has access to everything, ends up in the camp of they're all, smears or seagulls or misidentified aircraft or whatever. It just doesn't correlate to the story we're being told by much higher level officials quite consistently. So show us those intelligence assessments, show us the very gross summary based on the best thinking, the best available data. These are the possibilities for what some of these more outlier UAP might represent at these confidence levels. It might be a number of guesses, intelligent guesses. They might not be fully, figured out. They might be a range of possibilities. They might say, well, some cases it is these types of things. They're more mundane. Some cases these appear to be true outliers. This is what the IC thinks we could be looking at. Clearly, people have generated such intelligence assessments across the IC probably for decades now. The public was allowed to see these for COVID origination thinking across a variety of agencies. What was the origination? Was it lab leak? Was it the wet market stuff? They grudgingly surfaced these reports, again, kind of high level assessments that said, first of all, not all of the agencies agree. Most of the agencies don't have a firm understanding. They were kind of low confidence estimates. And it showed that there was kind of heterogeneous thinking across agencies, which is probably healthy and normal, and we would expect to probably see for something as complex as UAP as well. So it's like, well, if you're so sure it's all misidentified aircraft or birds, why not show us those summaries? My gut tells me it's because they might not comport with that public story we're hearing from AARO. Like, probably, I get the sense, might include some pretty interesting outlier possibilities that might be very low confidence. But I actually think that represents a good next step for how this issue evolves. That, like, let us know, smart people who have access to the best available data, the people who are charged with really thinking about this, what have they come up to? Where have they ever arrived at, even if it's quite uncertain? If they're so unwilling to share that with us, but make, placative statements, oh, it's nothing, it's this, it's that, we fully resolve, it just doesn't align. It doesn't align, and I think we deserve to see that. And if we even learn that it's within the realm of possibilities, I think that could be an interesting moment for this issue, because it starts to kind of validate, so all along the government maybe did think that there could be something to this that isn't an everyday normal kind of thing. So, Sean, if you're so confident in that, why don't you show us those intelligence assessments of what the IC over the years really thinks UAP might be? We've never seen such a thing other than the kind of rumored, now practically ancient estimate of the situation document, right? Well, there's got to have been some since then, because there's been plenty of both classified and unclassified or declassified, government UAP studies since then, including what's currently going on. Show us the top level, understandings. And then we'll have a talk about what this is or isn't, right?
I just really want to touch on this. I think you're 100% right, Nick. And again, this is one of those things that can be easily put to bed exactly the way you're saying, and they're choosing not to, which means it's not easy to put to bed, because that's all they would have to do. We've seen it happen with COVID, so there's precedent for that being a methodology by which to provide transparency to the public about a controversial issue. I want to make one additional side note. You mentioned several high-level people that have spoken publicly that are more higher ranked than Dr. Sean Kirkpatrick. A lot of them were Democrats. I want to also mention that this is something that's happening on both sides of the aisle. Under Trump, John Radcliffe, who was also the DNI, has made very aggressive public statements about the fact that these are happening much more frequently than have been publicly identified, and we don't know what they are, and they're not Russian or Chinese. He said that explicitly in multiple interviews. That's a Trump DNI. And not only under former President Trump, but in his recent interview with Logan and Jake Paul, former President Trump also reflected similar statements to Obama, in terms of what he's been briefed on and talking to the pilots and what they believe to be true, despite his personal lack of belief, they are spending the time to brief presidents about this subject. And presidents, multiple, have an opinion about this subject. The last two DNIs have made public statements about this subject. Two CIA directors have made public statements about this subject, all of which are speaking to a reality of a non-prosaic origin of UAP. And again, if that's not the case, the releasing of the most recent intelligence assessment or any number of ones that certainly exist is a very, very straightforward, easy, done before way to throw cold water on this raging fire and smoke that we're seeing. And it is not being done. And that is all you need to know. That right there is almost the indictment of the case. Because again, it is so easy to tamp down if you could, but they can't. And this is why we've operated in this weird space of them not addressing it, because there really isn't a way to address it without them getting caught up in potentially being not truthful, which is, again, I think why you're seeing when Kirkpatrick was in office, he didn't really say anything like this. His comments were much more reserved and much more in a box. And as soon as he's no longer a government employee, now he has a whole lot to say with the plausible deniability of not being associated with the government. So again, the mechanics of how the statements are being made, where they're being made, I think illustrates that there is a there, despite, again, what people might try to say about, well, it should be spilling out much more quickly and all this other stuff, which is absolutely not true.
I just wanted to add some real quick historical context to both of the points that both Lester and Nick have made. You know, with intelligence assessments and this having a history that goes back decades. So what I'm about to read is from a book titled The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects by Edward Ruppelt, who is one of the directors on Project Blue Book. This quote, he says, "Many groups in the Pentagon and the Office of Naval Research requested UFO briefings. Civilian groups made up of some of the nation's top scientists and industrialists and formed to study special military problems worked in a UFO briefing. Top Air Force commanders were given periodic briefings. Every briefing I gave was followed by a discussion that lasted anywhere from 1 to 4 hours," end quote. And this book was published back in 1956. So there certainly is a there, coupled with, in this same book, he mentions certain sightings that pilots have had, and these were pilots that were veteran pilots. One instance in particular, these were two pilots that were flying and had seen about 3 delta-winged crafts near their aircrafts on a summer day flying from San Francisco to Nevada. And these pilots had hours and hours in the cockpit. They were actually veterans that had flown in war, I believe World War II, and then later were flying civilian aircraft. So there certainly is a there. And the original point, that Nick had made is that there are intelligence assessments, whether they're recent in the modern times or we're talking way back in the historical record, that if there's nothing there, if these are just balloons, release the intelligence assessments. Totally with you on there, Nick and Lester.
One thing I'd like to bring up, slightly off topic, but almost slightly related to a couple of points made, is, if we look back at the balloon shoot downs situation, debacle, whatever you want to call it, we never really got to hear or see any information on that. And here we are, however many months, years later. But then one thing we have seen a lot of, or periodically, is very clear footage from aircraft or Reaper drones, for example, of interceptions with Russian jets and that. And they very, very easily and quickly throw them into the public domain. No, doesn't seem to be any issues with sources and methods or anything. And that really just adds more muddiness to this whole situation for me personally. And look, at the end of the day, if we're looking at the general public and a lot of the people who are into the UFO subject, they really want to see the videos and the juicy photographs and things like that at the end of the day. These reports that we talk about, we find extremely interesting, but, a lot of the general public want to see that glossy high definition image and video. And maybe they exist because, where's this consistency with the release of these kind of, this kind of media? I think that will always be something that I will bring back to because of the frustrations surrounding it.
Yeah, let me say one thing about the shootdowns, because some people are aware of this, but a lot of others wouldn't be. And again, it's not like it was covered heavily by defense journalists for leading American publications or anything. They literally just dropped the ball entirely, or dropped the orb, I guess you could say. So CTV, one of the major Canadian broadcast networks, one of their journalists who covers UAP with some regularity, actually, I'm blanking on his name offhand, but I appreciate the work that he does.
Daniel Otis, I believe.
Yes, I think that's him. Thank you, Lester. So, he did a Canadian FOIA request in the wake of the February 23 shootdowns that actually generated the return of a largely unredacted, there was some significant redaction still in place, but a memo that was sent to Justin Trudeau in the immediate aftermath of some of those February shootdowns, revealed several very interesting facts. It revealed that, first of all, it appears there were at least 4 UAP in that cluster of several days, because they talk about UAPs 20 through 23, which last time I checked, I think adds up to 4. Correct me if I'm wrong. We only learned about 3 of these things over 3 successive days in that Super Bowl weekend in the States. We know that they were up to numbers 20 through 23 for the year, and it says these are annual tallies in that memo by mid-February. So they're seeing a UAP on average, every day or two or several days, as an average number, which is huge. And that's just NORAD over North America and their kind of monitored airspace. And it speaks to the downing, recovery, and beginning of an exploitation process for, I believe it was referred to as UAP number 20. The public was told nothing was recovered. We have an official memo to the leader of the Canadian government that says, indeed, we did recover one, and we had begun exploiting it. And it was referred to as UAP, which is specifically not the nomenclature they use for presumed foreign adversarial technology. They wouldn't put that nomenclature on it. UAP are unidentified anomalous phenomena, whatever that actually is the wink wink reference to. So, or maybe a constellation of things that's a reference to. But we learned point blank, because of this release of this memo through Canadian FOIA and CTV's action there, that we were lied to. It's as simple as that. There's no other way to read the scenario. So, all of this is just a chain of evidence that tells a story that's so significantly different than at least the DOD provided official story coming through the AARO office. And Susan Goff, who I like to remind is a career PSYOP officer of the US DOD, and she is appointed to do all comms coming out of essentially the federal government, but specifically DOD, on the UAP topic. She has ownership of public comms over the UAP topic. And we're being told things that we later find physical pieces of material evidence, briefings to the head of the Canadian government, saying that what the public is being told is baloney, which is really troublesome, obviously. We like to think, our government isn't at least flagrantly lying to us about such things, but we have evidence that indeed they are. So, I just remind, the official story we even get about some of these events is clearly bananas. And as you said, Vinny, and this is kind of something I speak to in the declassification targets section of declassifyuap.org, because I speak to the need, one of the 7 targets is we need clear media on these things. And I actually provided several very direct references to fairly recent, high quality HD videos of, drones colliding with our jets or coming close, or Chinese jets coming too close, or dropping flares or fuel. these are presumably the same class of sensors. We see all the on-screen metadata. They don't block any of it out. You see all the little readouts, all the wind speed. It's like, so clearly that's not what they can't show sources and methods wise, because we see it. So sadly, we have to understand that we are actually being gaslit, and there are untruths that are being relayed to us. And it can be really, I mean, this is one of my biggest complaints about the UFO cover up, which I'm comfortable saying it is at this point. When reality, and you get official like pieces of evidence for what reality seems to indicate, doesn't match what we're being told, it creates this schism in our thinking about reality, our lives, the world we inhabit, our relationship with our countries as citizens, the polity that we were a part of. It creates this significant imbalance. And we look at the world of today, in the United States, in Canada, around many other countries, where, whether it's, expressed in a way I agree with or not, you have a lot of people who very legitimately have serious concerns about the government. They might put labels on that like deep state, which I don't personally adhere to. However, there are truths there. We are not being told the truth about this. And when it so clearly misaligns with the reality that we get tangible evidence for, it's highly destructive. And it really, again, as Avril Haines herself has said, really presents risks to democracy and some of the real fundamental aspects of freedom of information. A rational kind of liberal Western democracy, and like what the thinking behind it was. Like, we're kind of getting off the tracks now, and that's really concerning. But again, I like to think that the trajectory and the trend line is looking good, and I do think some people want to change it, so we're being told a bit more in alignment with what that background official story really is.
Yeah, and I think one reason why I brought the balloon thing up and why I always go back to it is because I think even a few months afterwards, there were murmurings of, we will be bringing more information out. We will be giving you something to sort of clear this up a bit. But then I think they just relied on time, that if enough time passed, people would just forget about it. And it almost seems like that's happened. And there's just a few of us who just are still irked by it slightly.
Oh, and that's like a classic PR game. I mean, just you wait it out, the news cycles, especially in this era. Every half a day, there's all these new stories blaring at us, distracting us from what we were thinking about, 4 hours ago. So that's a classic PR strategy. Wait it out. I mean, when they did the public kind of briefing on the shootdowns, which was like on the third day of shootdowns on that Sunday, they actually did the press call, which you could listen to as a member of the public in real time. They were streaming it or whatever. It was during the Super Bowl. It was in the second quarter of the Super Bowl. Talk about trying to bury something. And this is where the Van Herk's statements about maybe they are aliens, are happening. And well, almost every eyeball is on the Super Bowl, so they know how to do this. I mean, again, PSYOP is really the militarized version of public relations techniques. In fact, PR sort of emerged from World War II Allied PSYOP and propaganda activities. There's some great documentaries on that. Like The Century of the Self is a fantastic one. So these techniques are employed all the time, Vinny, as you've rightly noted. And, it works. But again, there's many of us who are noticing. We have to keep providing feedback to our elected officials, to other bodies, and like the Public Interest Declassification Board, other things that exist, where we let them know we know these things don't align, and we hold you, responsible for writing this to correct it on our behalves, looking out for our interest. So the more we communicate that we see these misalignments back to the people who are charged with protecting our interests, the better.
I mean, you don't even need to look that far for the example of releasing data on stuff. Yet, literally yesterday, there was the 2 Russian Tu-95s and 2 Chinese H-6 intercepted over Alaska. Immediately, photos everywhere. Immediately. That was yesterday. This is not 30 years ago. So I mean, we're literally seeing it in real time right now, right? And I think so. we know that they will do it when it's politically advantageous, right? And they'll clear it and they'll move it through quickly. And this is not politically advantageous for a whole number of reasons we've discussed before, so it's not coming forward. I do think, Nick, that you bring up, and I think Danny Sheehan has talked about this or framed the argument this way a lot of times, where you now have what they call perception management as the whitewashed term for propaganda targeting your own citizens, right? But it's perception management, so it's palpable. And it is a tool in the toolbox of the national security state in its dominance over the information flow, right? And one of the things that Danny Sheehan talks about is that we are living in a period of time where the national security state, as a general thing, has run amok, and it's now overstepping its mandate in a way that's partly self-preservation and all this stuff, but it is become so is metastasized into this extra governmental entity that manifests in problems such as running a decades long UFO program and not providing some of the basic information to the American public. We can see it in a whole variety of other covert actions. I mean, you could see the overlap, weirdly, if you think about Lou Elizondo, between Gitmo and the torture programs, which is also another overreach of the national security state, and the UFO subject, which is another overreach of the national security state. And I think it's interesting that having this discussion is actually pinpointing a larger constitutional concern about the balance of powers between the executive versus the legislative and the judicial. And right now, the executive, and by way of that, the national security state, is having an outsized role in the power dynamics of how the US is currently run. And this subject is a easy way to see that manifest, but that's a general problem that should be resolved and will impact other issues. And so, while some people are like, why this issue doesn't matter, it's not that important. Not only is it important for our fundamental understanding of the reality in the world we live in the universe, and one of the core questions of are we alone, even if we put that aside, it still has real fundamental tangible impact to these adjacent areas that more control over public transparency, information flow, not allowing waived, unacknowledged special access programs to exist to the degree that they do, and bigoted lists and all this nonsense, which is effectively a way to avoid responsibility for your actions, right? And I understand secrecy as a methodology, but you need oversight. And the lack of oversight creates the ability for these things to run amok, which is just a bad thing, whether we're talking about UAP or not.
Yeah, well said. Well said indeed. Now, I'd like to talk about the UAPDA 2.0, as we know it's been called. But before that, I want to just talk about, I think it was Representative Grothman. Is it Glenn Grothman out of Wisconsin? I may be wrong. He confirmed to Askapol not too long ago that we may be expecting another UAP hearing in August after the recess. Now, I'd like to just get everybody's thoughts on that. Is it something, do you think we will get it with the current climate of what's happening politically?
I'll say, okay, so I believe in that reporting with Representative Glenn Grothman and some of the other reporting that AskPoll has put out, some of the lawmakers are saying that they were trying to get at least with the hearing in the House Oversight Committee, trying to get that hearing sometime in July. Obviously, we're at the end of July, so it's not happening this month. And to clarify, the recess is going to be this whole month of August. So we're not going to see anything really happening in August. And they've actually, at least members of the House have already started their August recess a week earlier. So they're already on their summer break right now. The most latest reporting that you're referencing, Glenn Grothman. So Matt Laszlo had asked him this question about the UAP hearing while he was at the Republican National Convention, I believe, just recently. And he had just said, we're focusing on the election right now. And it's a valid, response because currently here in the States, that is at the forefront for a lot of these lawmakers. I think Matt Laszlo has a drop coming that hints at a hearing potentially occurring in September, if not October, before uh, essentially November. We'll see what happens there. Looking forward to that. But overall, I think with staffers, at least, maybe not in terms of a hearing, but curiosity from staffers certainly is there. Surprisingly, despite everything that's going on in the political landscape. And yeah, Nick and Lester, if you want to add on to that, please feel free.
Well, I'm a big believer in looking for silver linings, and I will just admit I saw Silver Linings Playbook twice in the theater for strange reasons. But it's a good thing to look for silver linings, and maybe the political chaos in the states, with now we have a new person running as the Democratic candidate, most likely, and nominee. There could be some benefit to UAPs could slip through a little more, maybe not so much in the crosshairs or the reticle, so to speak, that maybe there's just less pushback because people have bigger fish to fry. I mean, I like to think positively. It's not to say for sure that will happen, but we have to say, again, Schumer and Rounds, or Rounds and Schumer, have put forth that bill again. They were clearly listening to the public, ourselves, people who were using our campaigns to communicate to them, we want to see the full UAPDA passed. They listened, they responded, knowing that this is a crazy cycle. They still decided to put some energy and time, effort into doing that. We don't know for sure at this point whether the rehash of the full UAPDA regulations from last year, the stuff that didn't get passed last year, makes it into the Senate's version of the NDAA. It's likely to be introduced as a floor amendment as it was last year. We still probably have even a month or two or several before we learn if it gets in there. It got in there last year. There wasn't really resistance from the Senate to do that. So it really is going to come down to how things resolve in the conference committee negotiations, probably like mid-December or early mid-to-December timeframe is typically when that's occurred the last several years. And these are backroom dealings, but an election likely will have happened by then. There's obviously potentially going to be a new wave of people. I mean, if there's a change in who controls the Senate and the House, both whether it's the Republicans taking over the Senate, whether it's the Democrats taking over the House, and those flip-flops occur, it means new people are going to be rising to committee chair positions. We're going to have outsized influence. Not to say that influence will occur in the time of these backroom negotiations in December, because these people will be sworn into those positions in January. But again, there's just going to be so many moving pieces potentially. It could allow something to slide through. And, I think we ought to, again, look for incrementalism. If we get even a few more of the pieces of the UAPDA, maybe we don't get, the eminent domain clause, which I think is less important because I personally think the U.S. government probably has inherent eminent domain to recover potentially dangerous UFO remains that have come down on their land. Do we need that to be so explicitly underlined? So maybe that gets traded away, but we get the more formalized international disclosure plan portion of the UAPDA that didn't make it in last year, or we get the review board, which would be critical and hugely important. I think we could get a few more of those things checked off. And again, it just represents more positive change and, more avenues to get more surfaced, which is what we're all really looking for at the end of the day.
I'll just add a little bit of color to both comments. I think everything is all on point. When you look at the environment in terms of the hearing and the possibility of that hearing happening in the post-August recess, September, October window, it would be in the House. And I think the biggest thing to look for is going to be whether they move the budget conversation forward on time or not. So they broke for recess early and effectively delayed some of those budget conversations. This has become, unfortunately, a perennial tool that either political party uses to the idea is, the House they have the power of the purse, they control the money. So around this time period of that September, October range, we have to get a budget passed. And it is used as if we hold back a vote on this and let the government shut down, then that looks like the incumbents can't run the government, even though we're the ones shutting it down. So it's a cynical political play to create some turmoil, especially in an election year, being able to wave around, the government's shutting down, it's the whoever that isn't the incumbent's problem, seems to be a strategy that the Republicans in the House are gearing up to implement at least in part as their strategy response to Biden dropping out and potentially being switched out for VP Harris as the presumptive Democratic nominee. So if we go to a government shutdown territory, I think that's going to pose real challenges to actually having a hearing in the House. So I think that's if that doesn't happen, I think there's clearly the desire and the buy-in. So it'll just be if whether or not House leadership on the Republican side wants to utilize the tools for political reasons only in that critical September-October timeframe. So that's sort of number one. And then number two is I've been very vocal about being skeptical about the UAPDA passing this cycle because of the election dynamics. And I've been beating that drum all year. And I was just talking about it actually with you guys earlier. I've actually changed, I'm evolving on that position in real time, especially just given the last 3 to 4 weeks of political developments in the United States. And I've now moved to the position that Nick just walked through, which is I actually view it as potentially more likely now than previously that we might actually get something through because everyone has bigger fish to fry. And there, if we think about last year, there wasn't really a major political thing that, folks who were pushing back on this would need to negotiate for or over that was part of a bigger political play. In this year, I think that might be a little bit more part of the dynamics around where they're naturally spending their time and energy. And given the NDAA has hundreds of amendments, it's possible that there's just focus elsewhere. And also, we can encourage Senator Schumer, Rounds, and now Gillibrand, who just signed on, to say if um, any of the mics want something in the NDAA, tell them to kick rocks unless they pass the UAPDA as is. Because they might be in a position where they now need to negotiate defensively and ask for something from uh, the sort of Senate Democratic leadership in a way that they now have more negotiating position than they had last year. So I think the dynamics are very fluid. What happens at the end of August and the beginning of September, I think is going to be very determinative of what we see move forward in terms of what if the other political dynamics arise. Do we get a shutdown? Do we see an October surprise from the deadline of the reporting for the agencies for the NDAA FY 2024, which is, again, October is around where we should start to see records hit NARA in terms of that deadline. If we start to see something hit that has even a nugget, right? Maybe an intelligence assessment makes it through that we were talking about earlier. And if it does that change the negotiations going into November? So I think it's very fluid. Me, as someone who's been very vocally skeptical, I've re-underwritten my position to being neutral from extremely pessimistic.
So let's talk about what it actually contains within this UAPDA 2.0. Is it a mirror of what we saw last year? Is there any subtle language change? And for the viewers out there who may not be familiar with it, would you mind just breaking down some of the key points of what it contains?
I'll do a quick high level. So the core structure of the UAPDA, it starts with a couple of findings which basically outline why the bill needs to exist, which basically alleges that through the use of pieces of legislation from the Atomic Energy Act from back in the day, some nuclear classified material classification things, the limiting of FOIA, the executive branch has been able to prevent information about the reality of the federal government's involvement with UAP, both from members within Congress like the Gang of Eight and the American public. And so there needs to be legislation to deal with that lack of transparency issue. It then goes on to have several definitions for things such as legacy program, which is any program or contractor that has worked on recovered material or biologics. So it has a whole variety of definitions. It defines non-human intelligence. It defines technology of unknown origin. And again, these definitions are highly, highly specific. As it pertains to UAP, for example, it is a term of art. It is very specifically defined with 5 performance characteristics. Past terminology such as UFO, USO, flying saucer, that is included in what the definition of UAP here is. And I think this is one of the most important sections because it creates a statutory definition that separates this from, we're clearly not talking about drones. We're not even talking about temporarily unattributed objects, which are maybe this Chinese secret platform, but is not really this non-prosaic stuff. It then establishes an 11-person review board, a civilian review board. No one on that review board can have worked in any government program around this subject. It's presidentially appointed, Senate confirmed, which is a major structural thing. Like, that's like a really serious structural process, which is going to have high visibility from a news perspective because the president has to make nominations. We have to have confirmation hearings. Think about Supreme Court nomination hearings that we see on TV. It's blockbuster television. So it establishes that board. That board has subpoena power. They have the ability to provide and basically an amnesty program, witness protections. They have to be allowed access to the materials. They also have the ability to take the material from an entity and bring it into a storage facility that's owned and operated by a combination of the civilian board and AARO. It has an eminent domain clause that explicitly states any private citizen or government entity that is in possession of materials or non-human biologics must make them available for review by the review board. And the point of it is that the review board then gets to decide by way of the director what goes public and goes into the UAP records collection at the National Archives. And there's a presumption of declassification, which is a key piece. Like, this, everything is presumed to be declassified, and the executive branch, by way of the president or the agencies, has to justify why something should remain classified. And if that's ultimately adjudicated to be a legitimate reason, a record of that classification decision needs to also be submitted to the National Archives. And this is, again, a key difference between the function of AARO and the function of this review board process, which is AARO can just make a decision that this doesn't go public, and there doesn't need to be a justification, and there's no record of that. So even if people would argue, well, they're just going to argue to keep things classified, we will now be able to see the concerted effort to do so on a repeated basis. Again, if it's balloons and seagulls, why do you need to be doing that for those things? So at a high level, those are the contours of like the structure of the UAPDA. There's some details in there, but ultimately it does still exist as an executive branch entity, as sort of a board that is at the disposal of the president. But it does, I think, build off of the JFK Records Collection Act and create some better teeth to make it functional. This year's version for the NDAA FY 2025 is effectively a carbon copy of last year's version, with one clause that says that last year's version, if this passes, is null and void, and this now takes the place of it. There's some small other things, but if you looked at the version that Representative Garcia proposed in the House to try to make it into the House version of the NDAA, which ultimately failed, that one was much more substantively different than the version that was introduced by the Senate, which, again, for all practical purposes, is effectively a carbon copy.
Excellent, thank you. I mean, this is clearly important to people like Schumer and Rounds to bring it back without any changes or removing anything. It just seems that they wouldn't bring it back if they didn't feel like there was definitely some substance to this issue. Ronak, do you have that feeling when you speak to staffers that the importance is there? It's not just for the sake of it or anything like that.
Oh yeah, 100%. And I would also base that, from what we've heard in interviews, for example, like Senator Rubio, right? He's had conversations with witnesses, whistleblowers, same with Senator Schumer, Rounds, and their staffers. And I think this translates, into what we're all seeing when we're discussing these matters with staffers. And one thing I also wanted to add with the UAPDA, again, Senator Schumer and Rounds had, I think it was about a 7-minute sort of speech or colloquy on the Senate floor last year where they were adamant on working on this subject, staying strong and committed to pursuing transparency on this issue. And I just want to say to anybody that's used or utilized the Classify UAPs action tool and then our speed dial tool on UAP Caucus, thank you. it definitely has made an impact on lawmakers in DC, both staffers and the actual members of Congress, because I think it was a lot of our efforts together pushing for the UAPDA that really made Senator Schumer and Rounds have that colloquy on the Senate floor, because they're having a huge influx of calls and messages coming into their offices about the UAP issue and seeking further transparency.
Yeah, we don't generally run into major challenges getting the attention of staffers both in the House and the Senate, including some of the key Senate offices attached to this topic. We're in somewhat regular communication. We get pretty snappy replies. We feel like we're talking to the right people in those offices who have visibility into this and are helping their legislator with this UAP topic. So as Ron said, like, that's because when we call, they know that they've gotten bunches of calls and messages through uapcaucus.com, through declassifyuap.org/action, which people can use multiple times. People should use ongoingly. People should be picking up the phone. People should be talking to their own reps as well as some of the other key reps that are attached to this issue. Because when we call and they see UAP Caucus or Declassify UAP is in our signatures and our email, they know that we represent a large number of their constituents. They know that if you were to interview or poll Americans broadly and say, do you think the US government should tell the public the truth about what it knows about UAP in a way that at least is safe and preserves national security interests? The vast, vast majority of Americans are going to say yes. And politicians, especially savvy ones who rise up the ranks, are smart enough to know which issues people respond to. And they know that this is one people actually do care about. And I like to think, I'm pretty hopeful. I think they realize that if there's a win here, it could breathe a lot of hope back into people to think that, as we were talking about a little earlier, if the government can start to open up about something like this, whatever this ends up being, but I think a lot of us are in agreement it's probably not totally mundane based on our typical definitions of that. What else might we be able to positively affect change around in government? What other things might we learn about? If they can acknowledge this, maybe we should put more energy into pushing for X, Y, and Z that we've kind of given up on and grown cynical around, because many people would be cynical that we're ever going to learn the truth about UAP from the government. And yet we have 7-minute colloquies with the leader of the Senate and his bipartisan colleague, Rounds, saying point blank the US public has not been told the truth about matters including non-human intelligence, technologies of unknown origin, which is another one of the defined terms in the UAP Act that didn't make it in last year, but hopefully, those definitions do make it in this year. And so, that's key. It speaks volumes. And I really think, wow, what a sea change it would represent if people were like, wow, the US government finally copped to that. I think it could really breathe a lot of wind into the sails of Americans who have felt a little let down about whether they feel truly represented. And again, I think the politicians are savvy enough to know, this could be an issue that really helps restore some faith in democratic processes, and that's worth investing in, and why they should pay some attention to people like us when we call, or members of the general public and their own constituents talking about UFOs. It's more important than I think a lot of people would understand.
I'll just briefly expand on both points by also mentioning that the curiosity level and interest level and engagement from staffers is not simply from staffers of the known players who are publicly loud and vocal about this, whether they're in the Congressional UAP Caucus explicitly or some of the named co-sponsors on the UAPDA or past UAP legislation. It is transcending to members who don't really have a public position or profile related to this subject, but the staffers are, in some cases, either very interested or at least open to getting briefed on what is happening because they have seen other members or news clippings or the very little media that's been out there around it, and they view it as a legitimate enough topic to spend time on, which I cannot overstate how important that is. because we don't need to convince them that it's a topic worthy of their time. They're already answering the call, prepared to spend the time to learn more, because they already view it as something that they at least need to have an understanding about, not necessarily saying that they think it's something that they need to legislate around, but they do believe that they have to have an awareness of what exactly is happening and what's the state of play, so that they can know how to position their member accordingly within the subject matter. Um, so it's transcending beyond the usual suspects in a way that I think when people look from the public side of things and you see like what the media conversation is and what the interviews are, and it can feel like, quote, nothing's happening or things have slowed down. Part of that's because we just are so obsessed with our devices and we're used to this infinite cycle of constant stuff hitting us in the face. I think the acclimatization of a larger number of members in Congress is actively happening. Um, Not that they're going to do anything about it, but we have to remember that most people in Congress, all the 100 senators and the 500 whatever plus representatives, aren't that familiar with this to the degree that we all are. And that doesn't mean they don't care about it or wouldn't care about it. They literally don't have the information. As we get them the information, you're seeing, again, energy galvanizing around getting stuff done. So it's just been fascinating, again, to see the growth of curiosity outside of the usual suspects.
And I find that too, just how hungry they are to be educated by grounded people who know the topic well. It's why the policy papers, the kind of wonkish stuff as I describe it, that UAPcaucus.com has been involved with and makes available, briefing documents, kind of summaries of the issue, have been so well received by those congressional offices and the staffers who really kind of want a sober read of where the topic is. It's why so many people in government even have responded so well to the declassification targets section of Declassify UAP. They actually need to be told, well, what does the public want to see? It sounds so counterintuitive to UFO nerds who are like, well, duh, like we want to see this. We know it super well. They don't even necessarily think of UAP in terms of, well, these would be types of documents that might associate back to it. It hasn't been the focus of their legislative careers to look into the UAP topic. So when we tell them, well, it's these forms of media, it's intelligence assessments, it's at least data summaries, if not raw sensor data, but at least tell us what the data seems to be indicating as far as performance characteristics. Here's a few specific events like the February shootdowns from last year, or the very, very well known and essentially publicly acknowledged by the government Tic Tac incident from 2004. We got to give them lists and make an argument for why these are reasonable asks and why they do help satisfy the public's kind of pent up desire for so long for tangible information, because then they can say, oh, well, this actually sets an agenda for me. This gives me the kind of things I can look for. And again, the amount of positive response I've had even recently when showing gov types, even like government employees, even DOD employees, the declassification targets section, they're like, can I show this to other people? I'm like, yeah, dude, it's why I did it. It's on the website. It's like, yes, this was to educate the public to make these asks in this articulated way. But the other side of why I formulated it was to actually let insiders understand what a framework for releasing specific information is and having it be clearly articulated. It's this, it's this, it's this. So I think these resources continue to work wonders. It builds real credibility around the issue. We all have a lot of ideas, beliefs, and even maybe firmly held ideas about UAP broadly. But one of the other things I think a lot of the politicians have appreciated, and government folks, about the approaches of UAPcaucus.com and Declassify UAP specifically, is we don't bring our personal beliefs around the topic into how we present this information. We're not trying to create a belief system around UAP. I enjoy those conversations. And trust me, I have plenty of ideas around the topic that I give certain credence to or assign probabilities to. And some of those are, those ideas about what the possibilities could be that we're dealing with that I'm quite open to. But it doesn't actually have to be part of, how we present that issue with so much of that baked in. we can say, we just want to know what the well-informed people who have the best data on the topic have to say, and let's get to the truth wherever that leads. The public is ready for the truth, can handle the truth. We deserve the truth. We don't have to say, oh, and by the way, the truth has to be this. It's interesting because so much of the review board aspect of the UAPDA was modeled on the JFK records laws that were passed. That some people say, oh, what did that ever give us? We didn't learn the truth about the JFK assassination. Well, the reality is you can go to the National Archives and Records Administration website. You can go to the JFK Records Collection, which was documentation that was specifically spawned by that law that was passed, and its own review board that did digging and did some hearings and uncovered information. It's something like a couple 100,000 records that were released in several tranches over the years. It's like 5 million plus pages of information. Every JFK historian appreciates that information was made available. It's real. Anyone can go to the website and look at it. It wouldn't have existed outside for that law being passed. So there's a lot of reason to hope that, even what was passed in FY24 last year can lead to real things being revealed. And maybe we'll have a moment to talk about this. But I was able about a month ago now to go to National Archives in DC. I only had recently learned about this thing called the Public Interest Declassification Board. And they are a governmental body. It's kind of a review board. It sort of works with National Archives, but isn't officially part of National Archives. It's a lot of former very high-level government insider types. One of the people on that board now is Ezra Cohen, who for a brief period under the Trump administration was the Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence and Security, a very, very high-level intelligence role. So this board, I learned, I was invited by one of my SCU colleagues, Julia Mossbridge, to attend it with her. It's right at the archives headquarters. We saw the foundational documents of our government here in the States after we attended this meeting. And it was some presentations by the guys who do declassification activities for both DOD and the Department of State. It was really interesting. They did a couple formal presentations. They were talking about how they want to use more machine learning and AI because they have so much material that they need to review with very little resources, frankly, because it's not invested in enough to actually do the real declassification records review processes. It's a huge reason why so much doesn't get declassified is purely a matter of resourcing. So it's good to see that they're looking at kind of newfangled information management techniques to do that. But I asked a question, because again, I was invited, I was encouraged to ask a UAP related question, and so I did that. And they know full well that legislation was passed in FY24. The folks from DOD and state were totally familiar with it. I'm under the impression they have started to do some of those records reviews already, knowing that this October deadline is starting to come up, which probably will get delayed and they'll ask for some exceptions and all of that. And that's kind of normal. But, this Public Interest Declassification Board, they are there to ostensibly represent the public's interest around records declassification. I didn't even know it existed until a couple of months ago, much less you can go on to Eventbrite and register for their public-facing events and go and meet them and ask questions and see their presentations. So, I'm a big believer, again, let's take the wins like that law from last year, and then let's really take full advantage of the resources that are already available to us as members of the public. Those folks are, again, ostensibly our allies. They are a review board of sorts. They might not have been granted all of the credentials, but it includes some former high-level folks. So, they know how to plug in to the rest of government, military intelligence included. And, they, again, advise the president on matters of declassification. And, we got to show them that the public expects them to be our allies. That means more of us need to show up for their public meetings. They have a Twitter page. It's @publicdclass. You can tweet at them. And again, I suggest people are very reasonable about it. Think of them as our allies. The more polite we can be and more informed and give them actual information. Again, some of them responded well, I believe, to my declassification targets, which I made sure some of them were able to review afterwards and sent out the link. It's like they need those resources too, because we need to tell them what we expect to see. And if we do that reasonably and take advantage of them as a resource that already exists with a lot of connections, And they are there to, again, make the case for the public's interest in topics just like this, with laws behind it being shared with us. That can lead to a lot of progress. I mean, but we got to use it. We got to have more than me and Julia show up at their public meeting, which was mostly empty seats in the auditorium at Archives, and have 10 of us, 20 of us, 30 of us, get there. And again, politely with our, nice button down shirts and whatever, look the part, but advocate for the topic to the people who are supposed to be our allies in government. So, I have a lot of hope around even further taking advantage of mechanisms like that already exist. That, again, if I'm just learning about and trying to share with people like folks who are listening right now, we can gather more people together and, push these levers that we have in government. And again, I think the trend line over the next year or two, if we stand up and kind of do that in a more unified way, is really positive. Anything that gets added through UAPDA and future legislation this year and into the future is great. But we have these mechanisms like the Public Interest Declassification Board available to us. They have an email address. They have a page on the Nare website. People should read that, inform themselves, consider drafting a letter that goes to them. Maybe, frankly, guys, we should put together, some talking points for people to engage with that board specifically and have kind of specific asks that they can take to them. But these are all tools that are going to, I think, at least push us much further closer to the end zone.
This is such a good point, Nick. And 100, we have sort of three tools in the toolbox. There's the congressional legislative path, which is UAPDA, all that kind of other stuff. We have the FOIA process, which again, I think we're still grossly underutilizing. There's maybe one or two folks who are really doing it consistently, but again, there's a narrow box or subject matter of which they focus on just from a time allocation and resource perspective. If you multiply that by 20 and we go after each individual small breadcrumb, we know how much it can unlock a whole variety of trapdoors, but we're too narrowly focused just because we're not having more people do it. And then the third lane is this declassification board, right? And I think the point here is we already know how much impact one release can have, because we saw what happened in 2017 when one set of videos got declassified. It totally lit the world on fire, right? And that's just one release. So if it doesn't take a lot to change the dynamics of the chessboard, if between what's already happening with the NDAA FY 2024 and what might come out through the declassification board already, if we can encourage them, right? All it takes is one sympathetic party in a position of power in those orgs to let it slide through, and it's going to totally change the game. So I think, Nick, you bring up such a great point that, again, there are tools at our disposal that are not simply waiting for members of Congress to legislate, right? I know we are seeing a variety of folks really push on the FOIA angle. I think there's some really interesting things, especially with the incursions over nuclear facilities. That's a big one that I think is a great area for focus for any FOIA warriors out there, especially if you even take a step back. So much of the efforts are focused on DOD. We almost have nobody, other than Dustin Slaughter, and big shout out to Dustin Slaughter, attacking the DOE from a FOIA perspective, which, like, obviously for a number of reasons needs to be a target that we are more aggressively asking for information out of. Because again, regardless of the origin of UAP, I'm always someone who looks at the nuclear issue with that's really important. And if we're having even foreign drones in a world where there's such geopolitical tension flying over stuff on the homeland, that needs to be headline news everywhere, because that's a strategic threat that has 9/11 vibes of ignoring the problem when we have the intelligence that's identified the problem, but not the integration within the system to adjudicate it before something happens. And if you see what the Houthis are doing in the Red Sea with small drones, small munitions, and are able to effectuate effectively a naval blockade in the Red Sea as a splinter group that's not a sovereign nation. We've never seen that happen before. that environment means that like stuff like that, regardless of the UAP piece, it can be easy fodder again to drive an emotional connection to the issue that's grounded in something that impacts people's everyday life, which it tends to be a challenge when we talk about this, is how do we get people to view this as it impacts me, and it's not just this thing that once I find out, I'm going to be like, okay, great, my rent is still high and I have a car payment the next day. Nick, you're 125% right. There are these entities. No one shows up to these events. If we show up with 10 people there and say that this is a subject that's important to the American people, they can't ignore it because there's no one else there for them to respond to.
And it'll be 10 people versus, there was one guy at the PIDB meeting a month ago who has a big JFK information website that distills a lot of the information on the JFK records releases that Nara has done and presents it out in a frankly more digestible way to the public. And he asked a question, was interfacing with them about those interests of those types of records. That was it. It's like there wasn't people asking for all these other types of declassified information. It's like we could make it the UFO show if we wanted.
Exactly.
Like, we're really good. You get 25 people in that room, they'd be like, well, we've never seen public interest around any declassification topic ever in the history of this review board. I guess we know what we need to mention to POTUS the next time we do a little update, you know? By the way, it's all UFOs all the time, or UAP or whatever. Like, so we could do that. No one is holding us, the public, back from doing that. Please, people, like, I'll help telegraph it over X, but stay aware. And I'm so thankful to Julia and the people who turned me on to the existence of the PIDB. But it's like, okay, let's use that tool and let's show up, because it's going to drown out any other topic that the public is asking for declassification around trivially if we get a few more people to show up at those, much less if we could fill 30 more seats, 40 more seats if we wanted to. And that, trust me, would get huge notice and be kind of the talk of the town, I think, for weeks probably.
I think I just want to add real quick that I think what's important here is that the public really has an important role to play in so many different ways. And that's really what we're trying to do with both UAP Caucus and Declassify UAP, is enabling the public, empowering the public to take part in our democracy. That's what makes our democracy great, is we can participate and engage in it. And that's just like a democratic principle that we, really align with, Lester, Nick, and I, in the work that we're doing. So the public is not held back, like you guys just said. When we hear information from whistleblowers or folks more on the inside, they have, they're more on the government side of things. Excuse me. They are held back in terms of what they can share with the public due to NDAs and whatnot. But we as the public, we can push and keep pushing, and no one's going to hold us back. And I highly recommend everybody that's listening or watching to please participate in this process, whether that's using Declassify UAP's action tool or using our speed dial feature on UAP Caucus or any other different ways. New Paradigm Institute, they have tools for people to reach out to their representatives and senators. So there's so many different ways to participate. Highly recommend everybody to do so. And as always, if you do, reach out to lawmakers and staffers, just please be respectful in your messaging to them.
Absolutely. And thanks for saying it, Ronak. I was down on Capitol Hill yesterday, and I was like camped out for a moment and, waiting for a meeting. And, I was in front of the Library of Congress's main building. And then I was walking by the Supreme Court, and, the Capitol's right there. And we have all these other, congressional office buildings. The accessibility of our government as Americans, like, we lose sight of. It's the deep state. It's buried somewhere. Except you can literally go through a fairly straightforward security process in any of these government buildings. Every office of every congressperson in the House and the Senate has a sign in front of their door that says, please come in, like, just as a broad declaration. You can knock on it and open the big heavy wooden door and be sitting in the middle of the lobby of a congressional office space, and you can interface with them. Or you can show up at public interest declassification board meetings, or you can go into, all these other functions of government that are like right there to interface with. The biggest way PSYOP tends to work, especially for these more domestic issues, at least this is kind of my observation over now decades of interest in the topic, it's by trying to convince the public they don't actually have the agency that Ronak was just speaking to. It's because we do have the agency, and they know it. And that the only way they can kind of keep these topics at bay is, putting the wool over our eyes and making us think ourselves we don't have the agency to do these things. I very much support whistleblowers. Again, here we are on July 26th. Thank you to Grush, Fravor, and Graves last year, and all the people who were involved in putting that together, and the House members, and everyone who did that. And that's great. But what's going to push this over the finish line is the public. It really is. It's not even going to be journalism. It's not going to be the fourth estate. It's going to be average members of the public, like us folks here, and many of the folks we interface with online who are, again, quite energized around this topic and who are doing their part. And for us to continue to organize and link elbows and speak cohesively and professionally and have very well articulated asks and be very well educated on the topic and assert the agency that we have. I think the fact that it hasn't been as concentrated, especially over the last few decades, but it's changing, of course, in the last few years, is probably why government hasn't felt super motivated to, end the blockade of information on the topic. I actually think when we project that we are now taking this seriously as just another issue, like every other issue of serious importance, climate change, the economy, working families, all of the stuff that's super important and affects our lives, frankly, in a very direct way, every day in many cases, we have to act like this is in that palette of issues that we respond to intellectually and reasonably, and we know again which levers we need to push and pull in order to get certain things done. And it really intones that we're actually ready for the change. Because if we go into our little rabbit holes, and I mean those are fun and I'm in them regularly doing our UFO thing, that's great, but it doesn't necessarily speak to the body politic that we are ready to incorporate this in a kind of a fuller way into our thinking of the nature of the world and how we affect politics around specific issues. The moment we show that we're kind of soberly attacking this like another issue, I think it shows them that we're actually ready for the truth. And so that agency and taking ownership of it and exercising it is so critical as we move forward. And I am well convinced it will make the change. And it's already happening. Again, it was a great day for us to be able to do this. It just kind of worked out to be the 1 year anniversary. It's always something strange like that in UFO world, I guess. But what a world of change has occurred since then. And I'm convinced when we're sitting here on July 26, 2025, there's going to be some really additional cool things for us to be talking about, no question. And Ronak, again, you were a major motivation, I think, to both myself and Lester as we were seeing your work, again, going back a little over a year ago now on Reddit and helping motivate people and, again, reminding them of their agency in this. I can't thank you enough, Lester, for everything that you've done, such a leader in this community. Vinny, for just being one of the coolest people in UFO world and for, highlighting these topics. And again, fostering these types of really grounded conversations that really move the ball forward. This is doing the work, and so many people are doing it now. It's a really hopeful time to be a UFO nerd, frankly. I mean, I feel great compared to where we were in the early 2000s. It's a whole new game.
Absolutely. Well said. Thank you so much. And yeah, I want to send my regards to you, Ronak, as well, because you brought me on board last year to help you promote and work with you on your campaigns. And that really brought me into this world of advocacy. when it comes to the UAP subject. And I've learned so much since in the year from meeting you as well, Nick, and you, Lester. And I think it'd be a good point to end here. And I'd like to give a message to everybody who's watching this, because one thing I do come across quite regularly are people listen to these kind of conversations, but they do feel somewhat overwhelmed sometimes because they want to play their part, they want to help, but they may not be able to digest all of this detailed information. But I urge you, and I will put all of the links to all of the organizations in this description, to go to those links, because a lot of the work has been done for you. All you need to do is almost put your name to it, and you're playing a major part in this. Okay. So please go visit declassifyuap.org, go to uapcaucus.com and spend a bit of time reading, researching what's on those websites, and it will give you a clearer picture. So gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. I really do appreciate each and every one of you and the work that you're doing. Thank you.
Thank you as well.
Thank you, Vinny.
Same to you,
Pleasure
Vinny.
as
Thank
always.
you.
Thank you. And again, everyone watching, thank you for continuing to support Disclosure Team here. And we will be back next week with another interview. For now, take care and goodbye.